Hello, this is Dr. Ross, and this is Anatomy of Major Joints. This video lecture is just going to briefly go into a little more explanation on some of the major joints of the human body. Starting with the shoulder. So the shoulder joint contains the glenohumeral joint. This is a ball and socket joint formed by the articulation between the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The glenoid cavity here is shown in green. Okay, this joint has the largest range of motion of any joint in the body. And of course, when you have a larger range of motion, that is going to come with a lack or is going to be offset by a loss of stability. Now, the large range of motion at the shoulder joint is provided by the articulation of that large, rounded humeral head with a small and shallow glenoid cavity. Okay, so if that glenoid cavity was a little bit deeper, the shoulder would have less movement and would probably be a little bit more stable. The articular capsule that surrounds the glenohumeral joint is also relatively thin and loose, and that also allows for larger ranges of motion in our upper limbs. Some structural support for the joint is provided by ligaments, and some structural support for the joint is provided by thickening of the articular capsule wall, and that forms weak intrinsic ligaments. So let's take a look at some of these ligaments, okay? So the ligaments formed by the capsule are shown here and include the coracohumeral ligament, and this runs from the coracoid process of the scapula to the humerus. And then there are three ligaments that are all called the glenohumeral ligaments, and they are around here. These are located on the anterior side of the articular capsule. So these ligaments help strengthen and support the capsule. Now, the primary support for the shoulder joint is provided actually by muscles that cross the joint, particularly the four rotator cuff muscles, okay, and those are shown here. As these muscles cross the joint, their tendons encircle the head of the humerus, as you can kind of see in this image, and become fused to the anterior, superior, and posterior walls of that articular capsule. The thickening of the capsule formed by the fusion of these four muscle tendons is called the rotator cuff. Okay, and that's what's highlighted in this image. There are also two bursae. So we have the subacromial bursa and the subscapular bursa. So those are located here in this image. Actually, this is the subacromial bursa and the subdeltoid bursa. Okay, and so what these do, these are shown in bright blue. These prevent friction between the rotator cuff muscle tendons and the scapula as these tendons cross the glenohumeral joint. Right? All right. Now, the shoulder also contains the acromioclavicular joint at the top of the shoulder. Okay, it is between, it's the junction between the acromion, which is here, which is part of the scapula, that forms the highest part of the shoulder, and the clavicle, which is here. So this is a plain synovial joint, and it provides the ability to raise the arm above the head, and it kind of gives a greater degree of arm rotation. This joint is stabled by the acromioclavicular ligament, shown here and here, so you can see it in both of these images. And basically what this does is it attaches the clavicle to the acromion of the scapula. There's also the coracoclavicular ligament, and this serves to connect the clavicle with the coracoid process of the scapula. And this keeps the clavicle in contact with the acromion as well, even though it's kind of far in to be considered part of the shoulder. All right. Moving on to the elbow. So the elbow joint is a uniaxial hinge joint formed by the humeroulnar joint, and it allows for the movements of flexion and extension only. The articulation is between the trochlea of the humerus, there, and the trochlear notch of the ulnar, which are not really well described in this drawing here. Also associated with the elbow are the humeroradial joint and the proximal radioulnar joint. And basically these allow the radius carrying the hand with it to be rotated while in any position of flexion or extension. Now the synovial membrane of the elbow joint is very extensive. It covers the trochlea and extends up the anterior and posterior of the humerus quite a bit. The bursa include the oleocranon bursa, which is right there at the tip of the elbow. This helps the skin slide over the top or over the tip of the elbow. Swelling of this particular bursa causes a condition called Popeye's elbow. I just thought that was funny, so I wanted to mention it. The other bursa shown here helps reduce friction of the tendon and muscle movements. So all three of the joints on the elbow are enclosed within a single articular capsule. So you can see that the capsule, you can see it from both of these views. The capsule kind of wraps around. It's really thin, but it's thickened along the outside margins by the ligaments. And the ligaments around the elbow are going to prevent the side-to-side movement as well as hyperextension. All right. Moving along to the hip. The hip joint is another multiaxial ball and socket joint. And it is an articulation between the head of the femur, which is already highlighted there, and the acetabulum of the hip bone, which is really not visible in this image. So the hip carries the weight of the body, so it requires both strength and stability for standing and walking. And so for these reasons, the hip has a range of motion that's a lot more limited compared to the shoulder. So that acetabulum, which is the socket portion of the hip joint, is much deeper, so there's a larger articulation for the femoral head, or the head of the femur. This gives more stability and weight-bearing ability to this joint, okay? This is also a common site of injury in elderly individuals, particularly with those with osteoporosis, which weakens your bones. And so when you often hear someone with a broken hip, actually what they're talking about is a broken fracture of the femoral neck, which is located in that narrowed region. Now, the hip, these bones also have a surrounding capsule, which is very strong. It's got several thickened areas that form intrinsic ligaments. The ligaments are the iliofemoral, the iliofemoral ligaments, which are shown in both of these images. And then you have the pubofemoral ligament and the ischiofemoral ligament. All of these spiral around the head and the neck of the femur. And basically what they do is they are going to tighten when when there's extension at the hip. And this will pull the head of the femur into the acetabulum and give it more stability when you're in an upright standing position. So these ligaments stabilize the hip joint and allow you to maintain an upright standing position with very minimal muscle contraction. All right, so let's move on to the knee joint. The knee joint is actually the largest joint of the body. It consists of three articulations. So first is the femoropatellar joint, which is marked here with the red dot. It is found between the patella and the femur. You also have the medial tibiofemoral joint and the lateral tibiofemoral joint. These are located between the medial and lateral condyles of the femur and the tibia. So all of these articulations are actually enclosed within a single articular capsule. Now the knee joint functions as a hinge joint, so it allows flexion and extension of the leg. And so the knee is really well constructed. Really well constructed for weight bearing in its extended position in particular. But it's also very vulnerable to injuries associated with hyperextension and twisting. But also any kind of blows to the side of the joint can be particularly damaging to the knee. All right, so the patella shown here, this is a small bone. It serves to protect the quadriceps tendon from friction against the femur. So the quadriceps tendon starts up here and stretches down. The patellar ligament provides some stabilization to the knee. And then located between the surfaces of the femur and the tibia are the menisci, which are located there. So each one of these is fibrocartilage, and they provide padding between the bones and help fill in some of the gap. Now, interestingly, some parts of the meniscus lack arterial blood supply, and so they may heal poorly if damaged. Now, the knee joint has multiple ligaments that provide support, particularly when the knee is in the extended position. So, on the outside of that articular capsule located at the sides of the knee, if you look in the left image, are the lateral collateral ligament and the medial collateral ligament. These stabilize and support the knee when it's extended, and they prevent side-to-side or rotational motions between the femur and tibia. Now, inside the knee are two other important ligaments. All right, you have your anterior cruciate ligament and posterior cruciate ligament. Excuse me, let me catch back up here. Right. So the cruciate ligaments are named for the X shape they form as they pass over each other. And you can kind of see this in that hole we have in this image over here on the left. Okay, so the posterior cruciate ligament is a stronger ligament. So it serves to support the knee when it's in the flexed and weight-bearing position. So for like when you're walking downhill. And then the anterior cruciate ligament here becomes tight when the knee is extended, and so it resists. It kind of resists any kind of hyperextension that might be happening. All right, so let's move on to the final slide, which is just a couple more joints. So we're going to start with the ankle. So the ankle is formed between the talocrural joint. It consists of the articulations between the talus bone of the foot and the distal ends of the tibia and fibula, which you really can't see in this image because for the most part they're covered by these ligaments and capsules. So this is a uniaxial hinge joint. It allows for dorsiflexion and plantar flexion of the foot. Additional joints between the tarsal bones and the posterior foot also allow for movement of the inversion and eversion of the foot. So like the hinge joints of the elbow and knee, the joint of the ankle is supported by several strong ligaments located on the sides of the joint. Okay, so they're going to prevent abnormal side-to-side twisting movements during eversion and inversion. So on the medial side of is the broad deltoid ligament, which I've just got it labeled above there because you can see those marks going down to multiple locations. This is going to support the ankle joint, and it will also resist the excessive eversion of the foot. The lateral side of the ankle has several smaller ligaments. You've got the anterior talofibular ligament, the posterior talofibular ligament, and the calcaneofibular ligament. These ligaments all support the ankle and they resist excessive inversion of the foot. So as a side note, the ankle is the most frequently injured joint in the body, with the most common injury being an inversion ankle sprain. And basically that's due to stretching or tearing of those supporting ligaments. So the anterior talofibular ligament is most commonly the one that is injured. And the next most injured is that calcaneofibular ligament. All right, so let's talk finally about the wrist. So the wrist is also referred to as the radiocarpal joint. It's a condyloid synovial joint, and it kind of serves as a transition point between the forearm and the hand. It's formed by a row of carpal bones and the radius there. There are 4 ligaments that of note that stabilize the wrist. There's one for each side of the joint. So there's the palmar radiocarpal, that's the one shown here in red, and the dorsal radiocarpal, which is not shown because it's on the other side. Basically, these 2 ligaments provide stability during supination and pronation. You also have the ulnar collateral, which is in green, and the radial collateral, which is in yellow. And these provide stability and they prevent any kind of lateral displacement of the wrist during movement. And that is it for this lecture. Thank you.